Okay, those of you who are going to the concert here in a couple of weeks, this is the envelope. Maybe I should just pass it around. The envelope for the checks or cash, I guess. I don't know, checks.
Yeah, if there's going to be cash in there, hand it to me before you leave.
How much is it? $16.41 per person. 16.41? 16.41. And make a check out to me and I'm going to buy the tickets.
I would also mention, I wanted in the introduction to mention that Jeff was born in Jefferson,
Yes,
North Carolina, grew up in Liberty.
that's right.
So,
North
Eastern
Carolina.
Randolph High
That's
School.
right, exactly.
That's what I meant when anything you don't want me to tell.
No, I'm proud of it.
Where is Jefferson?
Up in near near Boone, not too far from Boone. up
Okay,
there.
It's the very far northwest town, virtually in the whole state.
Yep,
Okay.
North and west.
20 miles to Virginia and 20 miles to Tennessee, more or less.
Almost to Tennessee.
Ash County. It's right next to Allegheny.
You're in Jefferson,
So-
not West Jefferson.
Right.
There we go.
Exactly. But it's, well, 2 quick points, and then I'll take any questions you have. The quick points being about the situation in Russia today, and primarily the economy, which is, of course, as you probably all have heard and know, absolutely falling apart, right? It's a bit of a disaster right there right now. And in fact, your dollars will go quite a bit further than mine went. And we were over there with this tour group, as Peter had mentioned, just this past summer. The exchange rate was roughly 35 to 37 rubles to the dollar for the whole month. I mean, it stayed in that range. It was quite stable. And in fact, I was there in the summer for 2 months in the summer of 2012, and it had been about 33 to 35 rubles at that time. So it's been pretty stable up until about, 2 months ago was when the bottom really fell out. You'll probably heard some of that. The ruble was just plummeting. It got as low as 80 rubles to the dollar. And I read somewhere that the joke in Moscow was that for some reason they woke up that morning and they were measuring the exchange rate in Fahrenheit instead of Celsius. But it was disastrous, of course, for a lot of people. But then the Russian government, which still has the world's largest reserves of foreign currency, stepped in and began to use some of that foreign currency to prop up the ruble. And it has now leveled off at about 60 to 65 to the dollar. So still twice or so what we saw just this past summer, but no telling where it'll be at in June. Obviously, it still remains to be seen. It's definitely not as stable as it had been in recent years. And then the final point being really what is at the root cause of all of this, and it's Russia really economically right now is facing kind of a double whammy. Sanctions are part of it, without a doubt, although I would say a lesser part of it. I think by far the main issue for the Russian economy is the oil prices that, as you guys all know, have been going down. That, of course, has been Russia's main export for many, many, many years, and they've become so dependent on it. And, of course, they were enjoying those extremely high oil prices that were going, prominent for a while there. But now with oil prices plummeting, that's just absolutely devastating to the Russian economy and to the ruble as well. So I don't mind it at all when I'm filling up my car at the tanks, but it is not good for the Russian economy, that's for sure. So I'm happy to take any questions that y'all have, if I, to the best of my ability, try to answer them. Could you give your name too, by the way?
Yes, Carla Shanahan.
Carla? Mm-hmm.
How did you get interested in?
Russian. I was telling the gentleman here, as a matter of fact, when I was in high school, a cousin of mine who was very interested in literature, he was a bit older than me, gave me a copy of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which I really loved. So that kind of got me a little bit hooked, but then the real clincher was when I was a sophomore in college at Carolina, I took a class on the Russian Revolution, and I've been hooked ever since. So it's not like Family Ties or anything like that. The question, I forgot to repeat the question, being how did I get interested in Russian history?
Do you speak Russian?
Yes, the question being do I speak Russian, and yes, I do. Говорю по-русски. Couple, Peter and gentleman up front.
Danny Crump.
Danny.
how many different languages? Is there a lot of different languages, or does pretty much everybody in Russia speak Russian, or is there other?
The question being, are there a lot of different languages? And you know that Russia is a very multi-ethnic country. And ethnicity being defined first and foremost by one's native language. That said, in Russia proper, the vast majority are going to know Russian, certainly. Now, when I was in Moscow in the summer of 2012, and there's an increasingly large number, and I was there again this past summer, but I didn't, I was part of a tour group, so I didn't really get around as much on my own. But there's an increasingly large number of immigrants from Central Asia, Tajiks and Uzbeks in particular. And being that many of them are young, which is to say, grew up since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they either don't necessarily speak Russian or don't speak it particularly well. But even then, there's like the Kazakhs are more likely to speak Russian than the Uzbeks. I mean, there's variation there. In Russia, it is very multi-ethnic, but the vast majority of people will speak Russian. And Ray?
In prefacing your response to Danny, you used the term in Russia proper.
Right,
Would
right.
that be west of the Ural Mountains to say the European?
Right, and sort of what do we mean by,
That to a map.
go back to that map, what do I mean by Russia proper, which by the way is a very good question. The big map, where'd it go? Way back there somewhere. Oh, skip it. There we go. By Russia proper, not west, generally speaking, Russia is this huge swath, right? It's everything. So in all of that green and brownish area you see there is Russian-speaking population, predominantly, albeit multi-ethnic too at the same time. So it would be much more than just the Urals west. However, it is a very good question, Ray, because what I was getting at when I said in Russia proper, right, was the fact, and it's sort of the problem we see reflected in Ukraine right now, right, which is that there are large swaths of Russian-speaking populations outside of Russia.
Yes.
So that's why I qualified it a bit as with Russian proper. Eastern Ukraine is a majority Russian-speaking region. Crimea is overwhelmingly Russian-speaking, and of course now again part of Russia. Belarus, I think as a rule, Belarusian is more of a dialect of Russian than a separate language, although linguists debate these things, and I really don't know the details of it. I've heard Belarusian spoken, and it's very, very, very close to Russian, as far as I can tell. Ukrainian, not as much. Ukrainian is a different language, without a doubt. And it's, I think it reflects the years of Polish influence in what is Ukraine today. And Ukrainian as a language is somewhere between Russian and Polish. But there are, Russian-speaking populations in almost all of the former republics, including especially Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Lithuania has a significant Russian-speaking. So when you talk about Russia proper, I was differentiating it from the former Russian republics more than anything else.
Thank you.
Peter, and then the gentleman.
Okay. I'm going to throw a curveball at you. I think this group is going to be living with Russian families.
Oh, awesome.
First week they're there in Moscow.
Excellent.
Is there anything that you would suggest that they not talk about, or anything they don't do, or is there anything they should do?
Very, very good question. The question being, I don't know what being there for a week, living with Russian families, what you should or should not do. I mean, we were just talking in the break there about, it seems like things have gone a lot more back to the old Soviet days. You wouldn't have asked that question 10 years ago, or 20 years ago even. So the mere fact that we're asking that question, and it is an extremely relevant question to ask, right? When I was on this cruise in August, I actually did some of these discussions and talked about Russian history mainly, which is safe, right? Because you're talking about Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. But they asked, the Americans asked me for the last lecture to do a talk on Russia-Ukrainian relations. And there were, the Russian people running the cruise were, I noticed that day they were taking notes. They had not been for the other lecture. I'll say this, and it was my approach was, I didn't say anything to them that I wouldn't say here. But that said, and I think, honestly, the Ukrainian issue is so complex, and there is culpability, shall I say, on the West's part in this mess. And I think having a kind of open mind, in particular, and this is the issue that I addressed in the talk that I gave there, the Russians, and this is something that you could definitely talk about with them, NATO. I sit back and look at the world right now, and it's like, why do we still have NATO? Frankly. The Russians see it as we have NATO to, what's the term? Intimidate them. It's a Cold War organization. Cold War ended a long time ago. Of course, it was paralleled with the Warsaw Pact from the Soviet side, which dissolved in 1989. Now, admittedly, NATO has an entirely different existence. Since the Clinton years, he turned it into a kind of, with the interventions in Bosnia, into a humanitarian organization. It is also, by the way, as a matter of fact, the main provision of NATO being, if any one member country is attacked, all of the other member countries have to come to their defense. That provision has only once in the entire history of NATO gone into play, and that was immediately after 9/11, when we were attacked, which is why the mission in Afghanistan was predominantly a NATO mission, for that very reason. So that said, I don't want to say that NATO doesn't have it's a legitimate organization, but to look at it from the Russian side, that's what I would encourage you to do, I think. And meet them halfway and go at it with an open mind, because they're looking at this from a very different perspective. I get the Russian news on the cable. I've got to deal with them where I get a Russian channel, so I watch the Russian news. And you watch the Russian news and then watch the American news, and it's like not even talking about the same thing. It's all about Ukraine and it's all about the conflict, but it might as well be from two different worlds. From the perspective there, they see themselves as helping the Ukrainians, or helping the Russian-speaking minority in the eastern part of Ukraine. They see themselves as almost a savior role, and perhaps most importantly, they definitely see themselves as almost a victim of Western aggression, which is a fallback to the old Soviet mentality, and it really echoes that era. So I would say go at it with a very open mind. I would not avoid any topic personally. I think talking about things is always better, right? But talking about it with a clear understanding from their point of view where they're coming from. And they think that Ukraine is part of the Russian sphere, and the West, and specifically and especially NATO, is trying to take it away. NATO is a real boogeyman for Russians. And that's something to keep in mind.
How about the EU?
That's a good question too. The EU to some degree, but I think NATO gets the brunt of it because we're in NATO. I mean, taking case in point, these talks that they just had, of course. As of Thursday, I actually started midnight tonight, thank goodness, the ceasefire in the conflict in Ukraine. And who was there? The French President Hollande, Angela Merkel, the German leader, and then, of course, Poroshenko, Ukrainian leader, and Putin. The U.S. is nowhere to be seen, no representatives of NATO, obviously, because NATO doesn't have a place in there. And the media, Russian media, I should say, kind of reflects that in that they are portraying especially Merkel and Hollande, as peacemakers. Whereas any portrayal of Obama has been extremely negative in the last at least 2 years. So I think that for various reasons, the EU, it gets more of a pass. NATO, because we're behind NATO, is definitely the number one boogeyman in their eyes. You had a question before, and then the gentleman.
I was just thinking, while you had the map up, could you comment on the population density?
Oh, yeah.
As it relates to the geographical.
To the extent that I can, population density, the population, I mean, that's a good point. For one thing, it is by far the world's largest country, vast in terms of territorial distances, but not in terms of population. I think the population of Russia is around 270 million. I'd have to double check that.
So it's not as large as the U.S.
U.S. is more like, what is the U.S., 360 million or something like that? And I would double check the Russian numbers, but it's less than us or considering how large it is, let me put it that way, right? And of course, some of these territories, especially obviously the Siberian, I mean, there's one historian, Karamia, who says this vast terrain up in the northern eastern parts of Russia is, as he puts it, historically at least about as useful as the moon. And it's become a lot more useful in recent decades because there's oil and there's other minerals found there, but not in terms of population. You know, it's very sparse.
What's the density over near Vladivostok?
Vladivostok is again now when we get into the areas closer to China,
Yeah.
and that's a relatively open border now because of some of the arrangements through the BRICS, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So China, Russia, that border is, I wouldn't say completely open, but quite flexible. So that means that a lot of what that has meant in practice is that in this area in particular, the China area that borders with China, there's been a lot of Chinese populations kind of spill over into the relatively sparsely, historically, Russian territory. That's sparsely inhabited for that reason, though. But by far the densest population is European Russia, you know, to the west of the Ural Mountain, without a doubt. Gentlemen here?
This goes back to NATO, the issue with open borders in Russia. Several, particularly the Baltic states, are now members of NATO.
Right.
Ukraine has been talked about as being a member.
Yes, it has.
And, you know, there was, before the recent the elected government in Ukraine was overthrown.
Right, Yanukovych, right?
A popular rebellion, but
Mm-hmm.
it was out of the West.
But it was what, I'm sorry?
It was out of the West.
Funded, supported, yeah.
And of course, the Russians look at that and they see, what if Ukraine becomes part of NATO?
Absolutely,
And it
yeah.
frightens them, given their history.
Yes.
Has there ever been any discussion, to your knowledge, or would the Russians accept an invitation into NATO itself?
The question being, the whole relationship between NATO and Russia and the problem, and Ukraine, you're very astute in pointing that out because that was on the table after the 2007, 2004. There have been a couple of expansions of NATO. I believe it was 2004, come to think of, when, as you point out, the Baltic states were brought into NATO. And then the question being, has there ever been any talk of some degree of Russian participation? And there was in the late 90s. There were they were doing, NATO and Russia were teaming up with, they were doing various exercises, military exercises. I actually met on a subway in Moscow, a group of American soldiers who were there as part of a NATO, sort of a training, but also learning. It was kind of a mutual mission between NATO and Russia. That was like 97-ish. So there have been flirtations with that idea, but I think it works both ways. I think Russia, and Putin in particular, likes having a boogeyman. And NATO is a convenient boogeyman for him. And he can blame many of the country's woes on these aggressive Western forces on the border. And then, of course, it works both ways in the sense that, I think NATO has been just very foolish in the way it has addressed this whole Ukrainian conflict, in that it has played into those phobias exactly. Primarily by, I don't know if it's on the border here, on the map here, but in Poland, the NATO, which is a NATO member as of 97, and the NATO has begun to build up dramatically its forces along the Polish-Ukrainian border. And there has been talk about, mainly from Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president who was elected, the current president elected in May of this past year. One of the first things he declared upon his new presidency was he wanted to bring the Ukrainian military up to NATO standards. And that's a very telling comment, because when I talked before about, why does NATO still exist, there's, it's maybe borders on conspiracy theory a little bit, but I think there's something to it. William Hartung in particular has researched and written about this issue a lot. And one of the things that he has pointed out is, for NATO expansion, anytime a new country enters NATO, which has happened numerous times since the collapse of the Soviet Union, 97, 99, 2004, and then I believe 2007. There have been several expansions of NATO in Europe since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Every time a new country joins NATO, they are required to bring their military preparedness and their military forces up to a minimum level. Well, to do that, guess who you think they buy most of their weapons and supplies and resources from? Overwhelmingly, of course, it comes from the United States. To a lesser degree, it comes from France and Great Britain. So what this ultimately ties back into, I've said this, I guess, numerous times in various gatherings, but I go all the way back to Eisenhower in 1960, the wisest words never heeded, the warning he gave to the American people about the military-industrial complex. And I'm not anti-military, we need a military, right? And we need a strong military. But, we are spending, I think our military budget was higher than the next 29 countries or something along. It was something absolutely absurd. It's just gotten way out of hand, right? And we are, bringing it. I think that has something to do with NATO's continued existence and its continued expansion. Some people are profiting from it, quite frankly. So for Poroshenko to say he wanted to bring the Ukrainian military up to NATO standards, of course, to the Russian ear, that sounded like he wants to join NATO. And actually, he has publicly said he would like to join NATO. But the NATO has not publicly yet said. That was also a big issue back in the Georgia conflict, by the way, in 2008. The Georgian president, Saakashvili, had also wanted to join NATO, and that was on the table for them as well. So NATO is just huge, huge part of this from the Russian perspective, without a doubt. I saw another hand, did I? Back in the back, yes, sorry.
What percentage of the people speak English?
In Moscow and St. Petersburg, younger generation, probably, some English, 25 to 35% or so. Older generation, much, much less. Young people are learning English there, without a doubt. And urban, especially, I think if you go out in the countryside, I don't know if y'all have anything like that planned. That would be great if you could, but not going to find many English speakers out in the country, I don't think.
Another question. What are the three strengths of the Russian people?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch
What are
that.
the three strengths?
Oh, strengths of the Russian people. What are the three strengths of the Russian people? One, I would have to say perseverance, right? It's kind of this thing that, you talk about things that echo through Russian history. It's just this ability to, we see it now, right? Their economy is bottoming out, and when we were there in the summer, people were saying, Russians on this trip were saying, well, we'll just have to tough it out. And they've done it many times before. World War II is a theme that echoes through Russian history right down to this very day. For every one American who died in World War II, 77 Russians died. Just to give you some context there. Their ability to survive and persevere under just the most horrendous conditions is remarkable, really. So I would put that up there. I think intelligence. In my travels in Russia, they are very savvy. They're very intelligent. Creativity, I would include as part of that. Some of the artwork. If you get to go to the Bolshoi Theater, obviously it's kind of pricey these days, but it would be a great opportunity of something to do there. Wow. Third thing, one could go in many, many, many different directions, I guess. I think you said strengths, right? What's that? Positives, right. Wow. Help me out here. What's another positive? Music, right? It's sort of a creativity aspect.
When we were there, we found the people very friendly.
They're extremely friendly. Thank you. Yeah. Very helpful, very friendly. We had kind of two minor incidents of kind of an anti, it kind of gets back to Peter's question before about, you know, what to expect and what you might not do. We had a couple of minor incidents of sort of anti-American attitude when we were there in July, August. One woman in particular who was kind of giving us a hard time about, you know, Obama this and Obama that. And then I went up and spoke to her in Russian, which she did not see coming, by the way. And she was as nice as she could be once you got beyond once you got past the politics, right? And as a rule, yes, thank you for that third. I've found them to be, you know, you will not see, we're from the southern United States, right? So whenever I get off the plane in Russia, every time I have to like reorient, because I'm just walking around as I do here and, you know, smiling and nodding and acknowledging people, and then I realize you're getting all these cold stares and people looking at you like crazy. And then I realized, oh shoot, I'm in Russia, I better turn that off, you know, because it's a very different culture. Well, I've heard that it's like the North here, or most of Europe for that matter. Or what? I'm sorry? Well, in the sense that, I don't know, people are friendly in the North, don't get me wrong, but not as like, you know, smiling all the time. Russians don't like that, by the way. They don't like that. Don't smile when you're going through like the customs line, and I don't know, they just think that's typical American. But once you get beyond that superficiality aspect of different cultures, they're the nicest people. They really are.
Okay, we have Europe, right, and then we have, I guess you call this Asian.
Yeah.
How does this affect the country, say politically or socially?
You know, it is it's so huge, right, that it is loosely, you know, I'm going to contradict my earlier statement about a strong centralized government.
Okay.
Because in a government of this size, when you get right down to it, you know, centralization can only go so far. And indeed, especially once geographically you get out into the further areas, there's a lot of necessary autonomy, almost, I would call it, or decentralization. Now, I do think that the strong centralized aspect of the Russian government within the European Russian confines fits. But the further you get away from that, the more you see, you know, a lot more flexibility on the part of local governments, local leaders, and things like that.
So there's no major problem between the two?
There are some areas, I mean, this gets back to the ethnic question that someone asked before. There are a couple of areas. There's a Tatarstan, roughly in this general region, that has, you know, kind of mildly clamored for separation from time to time. That's not in any sense, not like Chechnya or anything like that. You know, it hasn't translated into an armed rebellion. But there are a couple other such areas like that that are part of Russia that don't necessarily consider or want to be part of Russia, consider themselves to be part of or want to be. But, you know, I think that as a rule, considering how incredibly vast it is, pretty stable considered.
The concept that you said was defining the culture a little bit. That the collection or the collective was more important than an individual.
Right.
Is that applied to the whole region of Russia?
The question.
Or is it primarily the European?
The question about whether this notion of sort of the collective good out, you know, trumping the individual rights, whether it's just European Russia or whether it would apply to across the board. I think that generally applies pretty much every. The reason being, again, it's rooted in large part, I think, with the climactic issues and the harsh agriculture, and that's something, especially once you get out. The best agricultural regions actually are Ukraine and southern Russia. And so ironically, that is the one area where, for example, you did have the Cossacks, for example, who are as close to a yeoman-type farmer that you're going to get in Russian history, who really did strike out. Most of the Cossacks in the south were escaped serfs from the north in the 14th through 17th century or so. So you did see some of that individual, and they in fact do have this strong sense of individual freedom. So they're kind of the exception that proves the rule in some ways. But non-coincidentally, they live in the best agricultural regions of Russia and Ukraine. But as you get, you know, the worse the agricultural situation, and that's probably even truer the further east you go, I think the more likely this sense of collective sticking together really stands out even more. And you have a question here?
I had a question about, I'm not familiar with how many times you've been to Russia, but I know you went back last year.
Right.
But can you talk about some of the differences
Oh.
you've seen recently?
Yeah. The difference, how many times have I been to Russia and sort of the differences that I've seen? And that's a very good question, by the way. I would have to sit here and count them, but as I recall, I had to list the times that I've been there on the visa application. You guys have done the visas. It's a nightmare, right? Even if you're going for a short trip, it's a nightmare. And I believe it was 10, so this made 11 times. And I'm so glad I just caught the tail end of the Soviet Union. Barely. I was there from February to June of 1991, and it was still the Soviet Union. And it was, believe me, entirely, and then I was back there, and after it fell apart that next summer, in the summer of 92, I was in Moscow, and it was changing rapidly, but still had a very Soviet feel about it. But economically, it was falling apart then, especially. That's when you had the hyperinflation. I was there with a group of American students, and we would go. They insisted on eating at McDonald's every day. So we created our own Big Mac index to measure the inflation. And every time we went in there, like the Big Mac cost another couple 100,000 rubles more. No, that's an exaggeration. But the price was getting higher and higher and higher. It was a chaotic time to be there. But of course, the 91 trip, which was my first trip there, I do kind of regret, like I talked to my colleagues who were there in the 70s and the early 80s. I mean, they saw the real Soviet Union, right? You were there. Martha had been there, what, 75 or something?
76.
And so I missed the real Soviet Union because by 91, it was already very, very different and falling apart in a variety of ways. The main thing now, have you been back, Martha, I wonder?
2008.
Yeah, I'm sure you were shocked, as was I, between various trips, because it has become very Western. I mean, when I went there in 91, you would get a list from people who had gone recently of all the stuff you had to bring with you. And this would be toothpaste, bottled water, there's a long list. Things that were either difficult to find or, impossible to find. Toilet paper. I would take my own toilet paper for sure. When you go there, the last handful of times I've gone there, you can find anything you need now. I will be curious to see, however, if that has changed. You might want to contact some people who have been like real recent, because with the sanctions and it might be going a little bit back to might want to bring some stuff at times again.
Yeah, just to follow up, what Martha said, and this is anecdotal, when we were there in 88,
Yeah.
2008,
2008.
2008, we stayed in a hotel, was it a Ramada?
The one, something like that. The one in Moscow.
It was a Ramada when I was first at Moscow.
I know what that is, actually.
Next to a seven-story.
Yes, yeah.
A seven-story shopping mall.
Right.
I've never seen anything like that in my life.
As well stocked, you mean?
Well-stocked, every store,
Yeah.
luxury stores from all over the world.
Yeah,
If you stepped off the curb not looking,
Oh.
pedestrians do not have the right of way.
Be very careful with the traffic, yes,
If you
yes.
step off the curb, a Mercedes or BMW might run over you.
They will run you over, definitely, yeah.
But it was an interesting experience. McDonald's, it seems like in St. Petersburg, there's McDonald's
Right.
in every second block.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of our experiences, because like your students, once I saw McDonald's, I knew I was home free. But we went into one in St. Petersburg about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. My recollection is that it had 8 or 9 registers.
Uh-huh.
It was 8 to 9 people deep, mostly young people.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
time and that. Any McDonald's franchisee in the U.S. would love to have business.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's very, the short answer is it has become extremely westernized. I took my daughter to St. Petersburg back in 2009, and I was worried about the food thing, because she was, 7 years old, kind of persnickety, you know how the kids are, right? We get out on the main street, and there was a Subway. And I knew we were safe, because she loved Subway. So we ate at Subway pretty much the whole time we were there. And most of those Western chains are there now. I joke with a colleague of mine who is writing, she's a U.S. historian, Lisa Tolbert, in the history department. She's writing her a book currently, working on a book project about the history of Piggly Wiggly. And how you guys know what Piggly Wiggly is, right? And how it completely transformed the way people shopped, beginning late 1800s maybe, early 1900s, somewhere in there. And I've told her that, I have witnessed that transformation in Russia. Because when I was there in what was the tail end of the Soviet periods, state-owned, state-controlled stores, barren shelves, just nothing there. And then you go back in a very short span, and it's like you described, it's everything very well stocked that you could buy just about it. If you got the rubles, you can buy anything you need, right? And I don't know, I assume that's going to still be the case for y'all, but sanctions might be having an impact on that. You've been waiting patiently?
I would be interested, how do the Russian people, the population, feel about their justice system, especially when you talk about the corruption?
Right.
And do they feel free to demonstrate, or do they?
Right. Very good questions about how Russians feel about their judicial system and how free they feel.
To do something about it. They feel free.
It's always interesting to me to see significant demonstrations in Russia, and there have been some, even in recent months, right? Excuse me, because those folks are taking a serious risk, and that's what amazed me. I've been known to go out and demonstrate this or that, right? But you're not going to have to wind up in jail and pay a $10,000 fine for protesting or speaking your voice in this country. Not saying this country is perfect, right? God knows we have our issues, right? But they have a lot more issues of that nature to worry about, which means to me the mere fact that they are still protesting says a great deal. That said, protests are quite focused and limited to, especially Moscow, major urban areas. And Putin's approval rating is still, last numbers I saw, I think it was 77% or something like that. Despite the ongoing economic problems, he gets a lot of his popularity from the rural and outlying regions. The protests and the anti-Putin sentiments you will find are not maybe exclusive to the major urban centers, but definitely disproportionate. His popularity is disproportionately in the rural outlying areas, and of course that's the vast majority of the population. So politically, he's playing it quite smartly in that respect, right? Catering to these less than urban areas, shall we say. I mean, the protests are usually Moscow, St. Petersburg, major cities like Rostov and elsewhere. And they are generally, you will see the riot police come. And, to get back to your question, Peter, about do's and don'ts, I would say a very smart rule of thumb is if you see a protest of any shape or form, get the heck out of there. Because if they catch an American, you are by definition a spy. What are you doing there? It would just be, I think, not good. Now, the chances of that happening, admittedly, are pretty slim unless you frequent certain areas, especially Moscow. But I would just honestly stay away from any and all of that, right? For a variety of reasons. But yeah, they're not very trustworthy of their judicial system. And I remember reading a very interesting article by an economics professor at Chapel Hill at the time. What was his name? I'm drawing a blank right now. It was like Stephen something. I remember him, but I can't remember his name. Anyway, the gist of he wrote this circa 1994, 1995, when corruption was like in the street, it was mafia corruption. And the gist of his article was that if you look at history, lots of countries have gone through this sort of evolution. He was an economist, not a historian, but his point was, they'll go through this period of mafia corruption, but eventually that will give way to economic growth. To some degree, you've seen that, but what is really, I think, taking place is you don't see the shootings at the mafia kind of stuff. It's not in your face like it was in the 90s. but it's as corrupt, even perhaps more so than it ever was. It's just systemic, and now what the mafia behind the scenes do is basically buy off the court systems and bribe the judges and those within the court system to do their bidding. So and it's kind of shifted in that respect. And yes, that is a more stable. I mean, I remember there being, in the southern city that I was in the 90s, Rostov, you'd drive by and there'd be like the store would be burnt down. That happened quite a few times. And what that meant was those people did not pay protection money to the appropriate powers, right? So that was much more of a in-your-face kind of mafia corruption system. Now it's still there, but it's much more hidden behind the scenes, and the judicial system is actually the main avenue for it. The gentleman here, and then questions up front there.
The very fact that we'll be going there through the organization.
Yeah, right.
I'm surprised that Putin would even allow that, and I think we've been going since 77
Wow.
to
Yeah.
Russia.
Yeah, and thank y'all for doing that, by the way. Actually,
We will be staying in people's homes. And
Yeah.
certainly we'll be sharing our culture
right.
and what we think about Obama or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think you've given some sort of a warning.
Well, and I do wonder, are the folks y'all are staying with, are they part of an organization? I mean,
Friendship Force.
and they're part of it as well, right? So, I mean, and I don't know, like, we were talking about this a little bit in the break as well. The gentleman, you had been in St. Petersburg, and when we were over there for this last tour, it was feeling more and more and more like the old Soviet Union. It really was, in the sense that the tour guides were all giving us the same spiel. Like 2 or 3 of them told us at separate times that Ukraine was part of Russia, you know, and you definitely had a sense that they were working from a script, probably a pre-approved script, which would have been definitely the case in the Soviet era. I mean, they always allowed foreign visitors, well, from the Khrushchev period on, let's say, even so to some degree encouraged foreign visitors. But, you know, what it meant in practice, for example, we had on this tour that we were on, our handler was this really, I mean, she was an amazing woman who was just all energetic. She was in her late 50s, I would say. She did just a tremendous job overseeing our group. Her name was Vera. She said she spoke very good English. She said she had been working as a tour in that capacity since, you know, the 80s, as the Soviet period. What that would have meant in practice, anyone, I'm talking Soviet, I'm not talking about the folks you're with necessarily, anyone with that kind of close contact with foreigners necessarily were KGB. And again, I'm not saying that as in watch out for the people you're staying with. Right? However, I mean, Putin came through the KGB, as you probably all know. It's now called the FSB. His career has been in revamping, and a lot of what he's done since taking power is revamping and when I was talking about how I gave that talk on Ukrainian-Russian relations, and Vera, among other Russians in the crowd, were sitting there taking notes, you know, I don't doubt for a second that my file over in the KGB just got a little bit thicker. File in the FBI probably just got a little bit thicker too, right? I don't know. I didn't say anything that outrageous, trust me. But, you know, it just, in the Soviet period, anyone having direct contact with foreigners, especially Americans, but any foreigners, were at some level vetted by the KGB, probably required to report to the KGB after the fact, especially. And I say that just to throw that out there. At the same time, I think they want American tourism, I know. I mean, when we were there in the summer, we went, it's kind of, talk about scary timing. Remember that plane that got shot down?
Yeah.
We left the Monday after that. And so it was a little, you know, a lot of people, they were told us on the tour group that a lot of people were canceling. And of course, especially in the summertime, tourism is a very vital part of the Russian economy. Very important. And so when we got there, first thing that Vera and some of these other tour leaders did was thank us for coming. They were glad we were there. And I don't raise that as a, don't speak your mind. Again, I'll go back to what I said to Peter. I think say exactly what you think and what you feel, without a doubt. But just be in mind that there's probably something like that going on now again. I certainly had that feeling in this trip this past summer. Definitely. I was very naive, if I might share. Back in '91, I was clueless, totally clueless. And only after the fact did I realize that. Like the guy who met I went with a group of American students from Chapel Hill, and he actually oversaw, I don't know what the term would be, but he oversaw the student dorm for foreign students. Yet it didn't dawn on me until much later that, oh my gosh, that guy was definitely KGB. So I was hanging out with these fellow Chechens in the dorm, with these Chechen students in the dorm. They would come by the room and play chess, and we'd talk about the history of Chechnya. One day this guy knocks on my door, the head guy, I should say, and says, I've noticed you've been hanging out with the Chechens a lot. I think you should probably not do that. And I was, young, naive American, if anything, kind of, this guy's not going to tell me who to hang out with. I started hanging out with the Chechens even more. And so I'm sure that's in a report somewhere written by that dude. But it didn't dawn on me at that time. And this was 1991 when it was all falling apart. It just wouldn't have dawned on me. I was naive and stupid. Now I know how the Soviet system worked, and I think Putin is definitely reinvigorating that to a significant degree. So I would just, keep that in mind. Not sure which way we were supposed to go here.
I want to ask a practical question. If you take, say, hair dryer or an iron,
Oh yeah, you need
you need a jack to.
They do sell them here, and you can get them generally there too. It's a totally different electrical system, so you have to get one of those adapters.
Can you tell me where to get one at Radio Shack?
Is Radio Shack, it's now closing though, right? If it's still open, Radio Shack would be the place I would go. Gentlemen here, and any questions?
Okay, just on credit cards and paying for things, do you,
Good.
I'm assuming that you want to definitely call your credit card company?
Yes.
Tell them you're going to Russia.
Definitely do that. Yeah, I found that out the hard way too, by the way, when I went over there without doing that one trip in the probably late 90s. And when I got back, they didn't stop payment on anything, thank goodness, but they had all these email messages from them like,
Do you feel pretty, y'all, of course, you taking a chance over here, y'all are about people get your card number.
Right.
Have you had any trouble with you?
I have not.
Trouble over there?
It is a big issue over there, as anywhere, right, to varying degrees.
Yeah, I just had to get you one 2 weeks ago because somebody, when I was in Utah, they were using it in third grade, and somebody was buying stuff at Walgreens and Rite Aid and Grade.
Ouch.
On the other side of the county.
It is, I've never had a problem there, nor here yet, not going to whatever this is, right? But it is, I would say anymore, especially, actually when we were going there in the summer, was right after there was some question about whether we would even be able to use credit cards. We were. But I think that the subsequent round of sanctions that went into effect in October even restricted somewhat more of the financials in the whole, but it was aimed at specific banks. So we didn't have any problem with using them.
So you take Visa and...
Visa was the one that was what I had.
I don't know if I've got, I think I got one MasterCard. So.
I was just using Visa. I didn't have any problem, and I haven't heard about there being subsequent problems, but I would go a little cash heavy if I were you. And don't trade your dollars for rubles in the airport. You might have to trade might have to exchange a minimum for just to get around a little bit, but the airport rates are absolutely terrible compared to what you'll get at a regular exchange rate.
Excuse me, Smith, I'll interrupt you. Would you use the same kind of jack that you would use in Europe?
I think so.
In
Yeah.
Russia?
It's the same system.
Same system
as European.
Thank you.
There were a couple other hands up here in the back, and Peter. Oh, we're running out of time. So
yeah, I'm just going to mention the chip on the cards that are coming now. You're going to want to request a card with the computer chip in it. We did that going to Moldova last year. And they are, within a year, all credit cards in this country will have the chip. But now, the ones that are being issued do have chips. But if you don't have a chip, Martha knows about that because she went through it with the Moldovan group. So that's, and we're going to kind of have to cut it off. It's more 30-ish.
Okay, can we take one last question back here? Yeah,
A friend of mine married a Russian woman and brought back a young child.
right,
And then he was going to Russia every year.
right.
And then he was blocked, and he can't go to Russia anymore, and he doesn't know why. That's kind of interesting. They won't let him back in. KBG or what?
Yeah, and no telling what went on there, but it sounds horrible, and I hate it for them, I really do. Well, thank y'all very much, I appreciate it. And you have a great trip.